Good evening, everybody. Ooh, that's loud. We'll try that again. Better? Okay. Wow. Hi. I'm the director here at the Center for Creative Photography. My name's Breckenridge Barrett. I'm also Associate Vice President of the Arts here at the University of Arizona, and I am so thrilled to welcome all of you to the Legacies of Light weekend. You know, so many of you have traveled from afar, so we have been diligently working on ordering sunshine, which we have. We have dry bliss for your desert stay. And we have a lot of conversation and community and celebration for you all weekend long. You've come to the center at a very transformative moment in its history. We're realizing our evolution in truly amazing ways. In the last 2 years, we've doubled the staff. We've begun work on a digital infrastructure that's very 21st century minded. And as you walked through the atrium, on the north side of the building, you saw a very big wall that is temporary, and it is the facade for the construction site where our new interdisciplinary gallery will be housed and opened this April. All of this leads to really new and interesting ways to engage with the center and its collections, not only the original source material, but through digital and virtual means as well. So I am thrilled that you are here because you are our community and you truly are participating in a new chapter for the CCP. Now, this weekend, the Legacies of Light weekend and exhibition actually started out as a conversation in my office, which turned into an idea, and then it really evolved into a national effort. And the project was enriched by broad-based research, and we really see that as a continuous effort, especially during this weekend. So please participate. We welcome your ideas and your contributions, and we really want to hear them. This weekend became a reality because of the incredible commitment and dedication of my CCP colleagues. In my view, a great leader surrounds herself with much smarter, more creative, and better-looking people than she, and I can tell you that that is the reality here at the Center for Creative Photography. I'm humbled and grateful to work with this group of individuals every day, and I want to thank them by department. Curatorial, registration, production, conservation, development, marketing, media, and design, facilities and operations, administration, and to all the students who work with us in various capacities. We couldn't do our work without you. I must also thank Arizona Arts, for which we are a proud member, and Vice President and Dean Andrew Schultz is with us tonight. Thank you, Andy. The exhibition is drawn from the CCP archive, but it also includes works from our lenders. And they are Scott Baker and Marianne Hesseldens, Peter McGill, Robert Mann, Lawrence Miller, and Rick Wester. The weekend would not be possible without our sponsors, and we are full of gratitude for their support. Susan von Kersberg, Fern Schad, J.W. Kiekhefer Foundation, Jet and Julie Anderson, Tim Hagyard Long Realty, Christopher Herbert and Nancy Welch, the University of Arizona School of Art, Richard Menschel, Glenn Williamson, Peter McGill, and Susan Paulson McGill. I'd like to extend a very special thank you to the Director Circle members here at the center. This group's annual giving makes programming like this possible, and I'm personally grateful to them for their belief and support in our mission. I'd also like to thank Andrew Smith Gallery and Etherton Gallery for extending invitations to their events to all of our guests this weekend. The School of Visual Arts in New York City will be live streaming the symposium tomorrow, and thank you to Charles Traub. Where are you, Charles? There you are. For making the program available and accessible to those folks in New York City that couldn't travel for the event. The schedule for the weekend is included in your program, and any CCP staff member can answer questions. They're all around you. They have name tags, so please reach out. They're here to help you. We are an archive, and we're always looking to record history, so we invite you to help create the handbook that is going to memorialize the symposium. All the materials you need are in the exhibition space that's called the Light Lab, which is the last room of the exhibition. You also must have noticed that there are a ton of contact sheets on the temporary wall as you came in. We have a table there with grease pencils, and we'd really like your help identifying the folks in those photographs. It's already started, but please take up a grease pencil, and if you know those folks in the photographs, just write their name and tell us a story. Let's see. All right, so now we're going to get to the real meat tonight. Britt Salvesen will deliver our keynote speech, which will provide an overview of photography's momentum in the 1970s. That's going to be then followed by a discussion between her, Charles Traub, and Fern Schad. But let me tell you a little bit about each of them first. Fern Schad attended the City of London College and immigrated to the United States in 1962. An early interest in photography is reflected in her various professional positions at Time Inc., the New York Public Library, and as picture editor for Life. From 1971 to 1987, she worked part-time at Light Gallery, established by her husband, Tennyson Schad. She was central to the life of the gallery, becoming close to members of Light, including employees, artists, and visitors. Following the close of the gallery, she stayed involved in supporting the legacies of Light, including lending to an exhibition at the International Center for Photography in 1996, and then placing the institutional archives of Light Gallery at the Center for Creative Photography in 2006. Schad is a member of the Trustees Council at the National Gallery of Art. Charles Traub has been photographing for over 50 years, with more than a dozen books published of his photographs and writings. Traub was instrumental in establishing the Museum of Contemporary Photography in Chicago, and he served as director of Light Gallery and president of the Aaron Siskin Foundation. His photographs have been widely exhibited and are held in major collections internationally. Traub has been a leading educator in the lens and screen arts. He founded the graduate program at the School of Visual Arts, serving as chairperson for over 30 years. It's now my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker. Britt Salvesen joined LACMA in October 2009 as the Wallis Annenberg Curator and Department Head of Photography, Prints, and Drawings. Previously, she was the Director and Chief Curator at the Center for Creative Photography at the University of Arizona. She received her MA from Court Hall Institute of Art and her PhD from the University of Chicago. Ooh, that wasn't nice. Her recent curatorial project at LACMA was 3D Double Vision. It was named one of the best art exhibitions of 2018 by the Los Angeles Times. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Britt Salvesen.
Wow, I'm used to being the person doing the introductions in this room, letting someone else talk, but it's so great to be here. Thank you, thank you all. Let's see. During my time here at the center, which was 2004 to 2009, I once stood on the sidelines in that lobby while a student was giving a tour. And the center, the student explained, had been founded a really long time ago, way back in the 70s. The 70s didn't seem that far back to me, and they still don't, but this invitation prompted me to do the math, and we're talking about 45 years, something like that. So during that time, I think we've experienced a few different versions of the 70s, from periodic fashion trends to more serious assessments of that decade, bracketed by Nixon and Reagan. Each revival has mined the me decade for different things, with photography being a key player as a mode of documentation, a channel for nostalgia, and of course, an art form in itself. In this talk, I hope to set the stage for tomorrow's more specific examinations of light gallery, and I'm keenly aware that any one of you in the audience could probably do this better. So please, no eye rolling and no taking offense at any omissions. I'm just here to get the conversation started, and we can crowdsource this over the next couple of days. I'm going to proceed in 3 sections. First, going way back to the actual 70s, then moving on to the 80s and 90s perspective on the 70s, and lastly to the ongoing presence of the 70s in the 2000s. Sorry, that's a lot of numbers, but it'll make sense. I'll conclude with some thoughts about just why the 70s still seem so crucial in the history of photography, and then we'll move on, as Annie said, to the Q&A and conversation with Charles Traub and Fern Schad. How's the mic sound to you out in the audience? It's not kind of, okay. Great. Some have argued that the artistic status of the photograph could only be widely accepted once it was clear that its day-to-day utility had irrevocably declined. This turning point may be symbolized by the demise of Life magazine in 1972, by which time 95% of all American homes had at least one TV set. So with television largely taking over the function of reportage, still images could now play different roles: subjective, inventive, expressive, and photographs could be seen as objects in their own right, not simply carriers of information. The existence of a widespread and kind of new kind of interest in photography is demonstrated by splashy features in the New York Times Magazine, Newsweek, and elsewhere, journals like Popular Photography in wide circulation, the initiation of the Time Life 17-volume Library of Photography, which launched in 1970, and even the issuance of a U.S. Postal Service stamp in 1978. Of course, decade boundaries are artificially tidy, and there were so many crucial harbingers for the so-called photo boom already in the 1960s. That turbulent era had already brought about changes in what it meant to be a photographer, where photographs were seen and how they were interpreted. For example, Deanne Arbus, Lee Friedlander, and Gary Winogrand, who could be considered straight or street photographers and who also did commissioned magazine work, were different enough to be recognized as new by John Charkovsky. The clean installation of new documents at MoMA in 1967 stands in deliberate contrast with the arrangement and style of installation in The Family of Man just 12 years previously, often described as a photo essay on the walls. Significant changes in pedagogy had also begun in the 60s. The Society for Photographic Education, SPE, was founded in 1962-63, and I've got a couple shots from later meetings here. Thanks to our friend Daryl Curran. And by the end of the 60s, around 16 MFA programs existed across the country, including the Visual Studies Workshop in Rochester. And graduates of those pioneering programs went on to join faculties in the many new departments established in the 70s across the US and beyond. At least 33 new MFA courses in total, including the one Harold Jones started here at U of A, and just a shot from our neighbors, an action shot, if you will, at ASU around that time. So with photography moving out of journalism or graphic design departments and into or alongside art departments, those faculties and students had the freedom and resources to challenge the authority of the gelatin silver print or assert its relevance as their inclination demanded. Some artists sought to redefine photography's material identity by combining the photographic image, whether made oneself or appropriated, with other media and technologies. And some examples from that period would have been the 3M color copier, pre-coded photo linen, early image editing software, which did exist before Photoshop, antique and alternative processes and equipment, and so on and so on. Building on cross-media works of art world stars like Robert Rauschenberg or John Baldessari, many artists like Heineken, Nettles, Daryl Curran, Robert Fichter, Betty Hahn, Naomi Savage, many others, introduce new notions of skill, craftsmanship, and objecthood, all with a deep and enthusiastic awareness of photography's history. And just want to note that the last two slides I just showed, those artists have earned some deserved attention recently. A B. Nettles exhibition opens at Eastman Museum starting later this month, and a Fichter retrospective just recently closed in December that was held at the University of Maryland. So it's great to know that those exhibition projects are ongoing. Meanwhile, back to the 70s, other artists took up medium and large format cameras, adapting this old equipment to their current visions. While MFA programs could be hothouses of iconoclasm, traditional creative photography, as exemplified and so called by Ansel Adams, did not disappear. Indeed, the experimental and the classic dovetailed in several contexts, such as the Yosemite workshops begun by Adams in 1940 and still going strong in the 70s. John Sexton, for example, was thinking to pursue a career as an industrial photographer when he attended a workshop in 1975, became a fine art photographer, and worked with Adams in the later 70s and early 80s to carry on Adams's ethos of darkroom expertise and an emotional response to nature. However, Heineken was also an instructor in the Yosemite workshops during the mid-70s, as were diverse colleagues such as Jack Wellpott, Judy Dater, Linda Connor, even Louis Baltz, Jerry Yulesman, and so forth. The workshops were, along with SPE, Friends of Photography, and other groups, which we can certainly compare notes, these were sites of community affiliation. It's hard to imagine another creative field celebrating its team-spiritedness the way Mike Mandel did with his ever-entertaining baseball trading cards. So that's something that's special about this field, about this world. With a variety of materials and approaches, many photographers in these years mixed political and aesthetic concerns, addressing urgent social issues such as feminism, environmentalism, the role of media, sexuality, and race relations. And among many other examples, I chose a contrasting pair here. Leeson's feminist critique combines performance and theatricality, manipulation, text, kind of a maximalist approach. DiCarava's black and white composition comments on African American identity and the subtle tonality. These are artists operating in different realms with different affiliations and connections, but really using the medium to express these issues. And on that, in that same vein, Martha Rosler's collages of Vietnam War photographs with House Beautiful magazine spreads speak the language of agitprop, and were even initially distributed as Xerox flyers. So lots of different senses of, or ideas about objecthood for photography. And writing about photography also flourished with diversity and passion. Now, there were generational debates, such as Hilton Kramer and A.D. Coleman, which played out in the New York Times and in other sources. And there were artists who also excelled as writers: Victor Bergen, Alan Sekula, Louis Baltz, Nathan Lyons, among others. For intellectuals and academics, Susan Sontag's 1977 book of essays on photography opened the door for serious critical attention and provoked varied reactions among photographers themselves, as seen in Heineken's SS Copyright, which you see here, made in response to Sontag's book, and co-opting the author portrait originally photographed by Jill Kremens, who is credited by Heineken. So the left image here, as some of you may know, but it's not so easy to see on the screen, is comprised of tiny photographs of Sontag's text, and the right one of other scraps of other random photographs made by Heineken's assistant, Hallie Rederer, also credited. And don't have to read this, and I'm not going to read it out loud, but this is a text that accompanied that diptych and narrates the deconstruction process with a kind of a questioning, ambivalent, provocative tone. So I think what Heineken's piece does so well is combine abstract ideas with the materiality, the malleability of photography. It's a physical thing, but it's also an intellectual thing. To be sure, Beaumont Newhall's account of the history of photography, first published in the 30s, remained a dominant text in the 70s. However, artists started to play a role in expanding the medium's history, combining curatorial and research activities with their own artistic pursuits. To name just a few examples, Lee Friedlander's discovery of Belloc, Leland Rice's Moholy-Nagy exhibition, which in turn was drawn from the collection of an artist, William Larson. Stephen Shore did an exhibition called All the Meat You Can Eat in 1971, which is a display of found photographs, not his own work. And of course, pertinent in this regard is the Rephotographic Survey Project, begun in 1977 by Mark Klett, Ellen Manchester, and Joanne Verberg. These artist-driven projects sometimes crossed over into the museum realm, where photography collections were managed by curators whose primary training was as artists. While photographs could be found in many types of institutions and archives, only a handful of art museums had regularly exhibited photography as art before the 70s. Your MoMA, Eastman House, the Art Institute, San Francisco. But with the onset of the photo boom, these museums and others generated many significant exhibitions and captured a range of new possibilities that were opening up. For example, 2 shows that Bill Jenkins curated for George Eastman House, New Topographics and Extended Document, are attempts really interesting to this day to take stock of that present moment, but many others could be mentioned. Moving to the other coast, Gloria Williams's compilation of photography collections and exhibitions at the Pasadena Art Museum, now part of the Norton Simon Museum, drew attention to West Coast activities. And of course, from the always prominent stage of MoMA, Peter Bunnell pushed boundaries with photography as printmaking and photography into sculpture. Richard Avedon challenged expectations of scale and of genre when he showed fashion photographs and portraits at Marlborough Gallery and at the Met in 1975 and 78. In fact, became the first living photographer to be shown at the Met. Meanwhile, newly formed institutions dedicated exclusively to photography reflected a growing impulse to collect and interpret the medium on an ambitious scale. Archive-based repositories such as ICP, found in 1974, and of course, CCP, found in 1975, the importance of which I'm sure we're all reflecting upon and appreciating this weekend. Martha Rosler commented cynically that, quote, photo exhibitions and art world attention to photography can sell camera and darkroom equipment like painting shows never sold brushes and paint, close quote. But taking a more positive view, new converts to photography, whether aspiring artists or enthusiastic amateurs or collectors, helped diversify the field and uphold its democratic aspirations. Unlike more traditional media, photography's audience has always included a large proportion of practitioners, something that's true of our group today, for sure. And if photo exhibitions helped sell cameras, they also help sell photographs. It is now time to take note of the emergence of specialist photography galleries in this period. The Whitkin Gallery opened in New York in 1969, the Lund Gallery in DC in 71, and of course, Light Gallery in New York that same year. By 1974, there were at least 15 photo galleries in New York. And on the other coast, Stephen White and G. Ray Hawkins, both 1975, and, I forgot another picture of the exterior of Light, another action shot. On the other coast, in the 70s, Stephen White and G. Ray Hawkins in LA in 75, and Jeffrey Frankel in 1979. So what were these galleries showing and selling? How were they defining and directing patronage? Some dealers brought prior experience with prints or antiquarian books, transposing those criteria of rarity, originality, and quality from older fields to the new one. And many dealers sought to draw clients with recognizable classics while also hoping to make discoveries of their own. Among the discoveries of, and I'm thinking of the non-contemporary materials of the photo boom, were Marion Post Wolcott, Mike Disfarmer, Edward Sheriff Curtis. The market, the new kind of growing market, embraced old masters from the 19th century, prominent 20th century figures, and certain types of contemporary production. But think about how different all those things are. Each of those categories differed so widely that a new, I guess, overarching vocabulary had to grow to support a general category of photography saleable in art galleries, if you will. I mean, we all know there's not just one photography, but you did need a language to talk about it, especially for people who might be new to thinking about it. And arguably, one of the most significant of those new terms was vintage, to designate a print made by the photographer or under their direct supervision close to the time that the negative was exposed. Although negatives can theoretically yield any number of prints, I don't need to tell anyone here that darkroom work can be arduous and supplies can be expensive. Photographers traditionally made 1 or 2 prints for personal use and for exhibition, producing perhaps a few additional prints to order. So vintage prints by artists of Edward Weston's generation, for example, were almost too scarce to sustain a market, leading to the fact of later printing and later prints that acquired their own status, especially when supervised, as was the case with Weston, by the artist or those close to him. Prints made at different times can, of course, vary significantly because the photographer could change their taste, or the publisher might identify a change in the market's taste, or older materials simply no longer available. A notable example, one that I've always been fascinated with, revolves around Edward Weston's 1925 studies of his son Neil. So Weston took these pictures with a 3 1/4 by 4 1/4 Graflex and first made palladium prints. He himself came to prefer a larger, sharper print, so he made 8 by 10 gelatin silver prints as well. When the Whitkin Gallery assembled a posthumous portfolio in 1977, the photographer George Tice went back to option A and made contact prints from the smaller negatives using the palladium process. The earlier and later works differ not only in size, but in tonal effect. The silver print has this cool polish of kind of a marble effect, and the palladium has this sort of a glowing, soft pearl effect. But print connoisseurship of that kind did not necessarily apply in the contemporary market because some artists deliberately flaunted or thwarted that. Light Gallery, while certainly respecting and featuring classic gelatin silver printing, was also, as we learn in the exhibition here, a laboratory for experimentation, welcoming rebels and mavericks. It was at Light that Robert Mapplethorpe had his first solo show, and where Stephen Shore first showed American Surfaces, comprised of snapshots ordered from photo finishing service. Light was generally open to color, to work that had to be presented in series, to image-text combinations, and so on. As I noted at the outset of this talk, journals like Newsweek or Barron's or Fortune fueled an interest or stoked an interest in collecting photography as an investment. They published optimistic articles with advice. Photography seemed wide open and accessible, especially in comparison with conceptualism, minimalism, performance art, video, which were not always collectible in the traditional sense of the word. From today's perspective, we can only shake our heads and wish for those prices. Here's an excerpted quotation from 1975 comparing the upstart medium to traditional graphic arts, so dealing in multiples here. Quote, prices for Walker Evans's photographs were indeed impressive, for most fell into the $1,000 range. But they're unique prints, whereas lithographs by George Bellows, issued in editions of 90, brought $2,000. An etching by Edward Hopper brings up to $6,000. In contrast, prices of photographs by some truly creative younger photographers, such as Jerry Uelsman, Brett Weston, and Leslie Krims, are between $60 and $125, close quote. Then it would have been unthinkable that a photograph by a contemporary photographer would fetch prices exponentially greater than an Evans or a Weston, as routinely happens today. But prices, even for canonical photographers, lingered in the low 4 digits for a while. In 1975, Light's pricing of a Paul Strand at $10,000 was a gamble, and one that paid off then. The Hallmark collection, which Keith Davis started to build in 1979, stands among successful testaments to what was possible at that time, along with other corporate, private, and public collections begun then. But the assumption that photographs would fit seamlessly into the marketplace and make fortunes for all involved inevitably led to some disappointments. The practice of limiting editions especially kind of paradoxically flooded the market in some ways with more photographs than would have resulted from the traditional open editions. And I think more so, and I just put this in there because it's a photograph about photography, furthered a misconception that photographic prints were as easily produced as Xerox copies, and that they were, kind of infinitely multipliable. The market alone could not sustain most artists who relied on teaching salaries and or on grants. The National Endowment for the Arts, and some younger people in the audience might not be familiar with that term, was founded in 1965 and steadily expanded its support of photography through the 70s, initiating a special funding program that removed photographers from competition with the traditional artistic media, and was intended to help fund practices that were then least able to survive in the private sector: film, video, performance, and yes, photography. You will often see in credit lines in this presentation and in galleries and permanent collections, museum purchase grants like this one. So those are always, I wish I'd been able to get some of that, get some of those funds. They're long gone. One joke made during this so-called golden age was that the NEA should give grants to audiences to go and look at all the funded projects. Sarkovsky's Mirrors and Windows of 1978 sums up much of the museum-based photographic practice at the time, but postmodernism was opening a new path, as seen in Douglas Crimp's Pictures exhibition, which occurred just the year before. Now, a moment ago, I showed you George Tice's prints of Weston's negatives. Similar in appearance, but totally different in concept, were Sherry Levine's 1980 versions of Weston's Nudes of Neil. Still with me? Levine did not seek to produce a fine print of her own. Indeed, she did not even reproduce a fine print by Tice or by Weston. Her photographs are of an offset poster distributed by Witkin Gallery. The poster you see on the left is what Sherry Levine photographed to make her rephotographs, which you see behind Douglas Crimp in the other, in the portrait. So this brings us to the edge and to the end of the actual 70s and into the 80s and 90s with the Reagan-Bush-Clinton administration. Over the course of these years, the 70s were first repudiated and then selectively reinterpreted in pop culture, as happens generationally. Films set in the 70s include Sid and Nancy, Dazed and Confused, Boogie Nights. Many of these feel to me like music-driven tales told by filmmakers who had lived it. There was a bit more resistance to 70s fashion for a while, more or less scorned until Tom Ford revived it in the mid-90s. Interestingly, just staying for a moment in the mass culture realm, these films, Under Fire and Salvador, depict photojournalists in current conflict zones, which testifies, I think, to the persistence of that idea of the photographer as a hired gun and out in the world capturing reality, whereas, as I've already suggested, museums, universities, and MFA programs continue to dispute or challenge photography's claims to transparency or objectivity and to really push the medium into other territories. Museum departments tended in this time to collect photojournalism in a rather piecemeal manner, reflecting the fact that they're founded during a postmodern moment and caught between the Newhall canon and the contemporary deconstruction of it. The list of American museum departments founded in the 80s and 90s includes, among many others, LACMA's, the Getty's, Houston, the National Gallery, and so on, spurring the formation in 1983 of the Oracle Gathering for Curators. And here's Jim Enyart's correspondence relating to that group, and here's the very first meeting. So here, a little Arizona shout out, as this is where that meeting happened. As the MFA programs had produced instructors, the curatorial programs at Eastman House, New Mexico, and so on, produced curators with varied backgrounds and historical interest, who joined the photographer curators of the 70s. And during my own undergraduate and graduate studies in the 90s, I was lucky enough to be in an art history department that had a photo historian, Joel Snyder, and I discovered that photography could be a legitimate research topic. Our reading list still included Newhall, but we also looked for alternative social histories and theoretical engagements. We were avid readers of Sekula, John Tagg, Rosalind Krauss. Postmodernism, with its emphasis on photographic image as opposed to object and representation, gave the medium a new power and relevance, although not without trading off some hard-won claims to originality, uniqueness, and expression. Critical theory could be unkind to canonical masters like Ansel Adams and to John Tchaikovsky as the curator deemed responsible for their renown, a critique offered by, among others, Christopher Phillips in the 1982 essay, The Judgment Seat of Photography. Now, part of what felt refreshing about the pictures generation was the centrality of women. Cindy Sherman, I mentioned Levine, Barbara Kruger, Laurie Simmons, although the elevation of these artists did not necessarily benefit equally gifted contemporaries who remained more closely affiliated with the photography world. That's something I think that still requires some reassessment and evaluation. And this isn't totally a trip down Britt's memory lane, just one more commentary. Among my mentors as a curator were Mark Hayworth Booth, who is an art historian, a poet, and a curator at the Victorian Albert, and Chris Titterington, who is a junior curator there, and actually took the reverse path and left the museum to become an artist. It was there in their shared office where I saw my first contemporary photographs, and they were both by women, Sarah Charlesworth and Helen Chadwick, who I think you can see in these slides really drew upon innovations of the 70s in these works made a bit later than that. So in the 80s, you could sometimes see some strange bedfellows. For example, a 1983 group show at the Contemporary Arts Museum in Houston, The Heroic Figure, brought together Cindy Sherman, Robert Longo, David Sally, Julian Schnabel, and Robert Mapplethorpe, among others. Mapplethorpe was represented in the show with portraits and still lifes, and he also made these artist portraits in conjunction with the show for the catalog. Cindy Sherman explained later, quote, "I'd always respected Mapplethorpe as a photographer, but I sensed that towards the end of his life, the time that I knew him, he was very competitive with me because I was considered an art photographer. But I was also kind of competitive or jealous of him because he was so successful at what he did," close quote. So these kind of different worlds of photography. Of course, neither of them knew at the time that just a few years later, Mapplethorpe's work from the 70s, included in Janet Cardon's traveling retrospective, The Perfect Moment, would become Exhibit A in the Culture Wars, deemed indecent for depicting gay sex acts and children's nudity or near nudity. The now famous obscenity trial in Cincinnati in 1990 was in some ways a trial of the 70s and that decade's perceived hedonism now overtaken by a fear of AIDS. And it must be noted that in addition to Mapplethorpe, so many photographic artists of the 70s were lost in the 80s and early 90s to AIDS. Peter Hujar, Mark Morris Road, David Wojnarowicz, Jimmy DeSana, Tseng Kwang Chi, and more. Mapplethorpe himself had already died when the controversy flared up in Cincinnati. Absent the artist, photography curators found themselves drawn into the debate, literally on trial, and at the advice of the defense attorneys, they sidestepped the identity politics and relied on formal analysis and genius discourse to defend the artistic status of Mapplethorpe's work. After the acquittal of the director, Dennis Barry, it was momentarily unclear whether Mapplethorpe would go down in history as a political and sexual radical or as a genuinely talented artist, whether, as this cartoon asks, he would end up in the art library or the law library. We can still kind of have that conversation, but it was certainly the case that he was a household name and that photography's power was acknowledged in the public sphere. If photography was on trial in 1989, it was also celebrated on the occasion of its 150th anniversary. Mapplethorpe was included on The Art of Fixing a Shadow. And for the catalog of that exhibition, Colin Westerbeck wrote the chapter on 20th century photography, highlighting new topographics from the 70s and also including 70s color by Helen Levitt, William Eggleston, and Stephen Shore. The two other publications seen here, Andy Grunberg and Kathy Gauss's Photography and Art of '87, and Charles Demaray's Proof, Los Angeles Art and the Photograph of '92, testified to photography's diversity, expanded scope, and significance within contemporary art. When I had my first museum internships in the late 80s, early 90s, it was interesting, and actually it still is interesting to see which 70s photographs enter contemporary departments versus photography departments in more encyclopedic museums. So for example, Eleanor Anton's 1972 carving was acquired by the Art Institute's Modern and Contemporary Department in 1996. Whereas Judith Golden's self-portrait example here from 1978 was purchased by LACMA's photography department in 1988. So these are both serial performative self-portrait works infused with feminist politics and institutional critique, and they had different pathways into the museum. Likewise, Robert Smithson's Mirror Displacements and John Davola's Zuma, both of them serial performative interventions in the landscape, went respectively to contemporary and photography departments in the 80s and 90s. This gives us a foothold into the issue of color photography made and shown in the 70s and attracting even more attention in the subsequent decades. We're, I'm sure, all familiar with the early 80s publications of Sally Auclair, and I also want to mention Sally Stein's work, publications about Harry Callahan's color work, which also provide a larger overview of the role of color. These pointed to an expansion of the literature for sure, and a gradual dismissal of that old association of color with vulgarity or advertising. So while color became quite accepted aesthetically in the 80s and 90s, its preservation was recognized as a problem. The Image Permanence Institute was founded in '85, and many museums were reluctant to acquire color at first, including CCP. But by the end of the century, of course, all serious museum collections had to include color, leading some to invest in cold storage or to adopt policies of acquiring archive prints. The exciting quality of the art forced curators to overcome their anxieties about fading, and gallerists of the period also played an important role by convincing collectors likewise. So speaking of galleries, Light Gallery closed in 1982, but almost immediately a crop of former staffers founded their own photography spaces. Peter McGill, Larry Miller, Robert Mann, and others that we'll be talking about and thinking about during this symposium. And getting there before those New Yorkers, Terry Etherton here in Tucson in 1981, and I apologize to all whom I can't mention right now, and I thank CCP doctoral student Molly Kalkstein for sharing her detailed timeline of photography galleries, much more complete than I can provide. And for a social perspective on gallery activity, you can have fun looking through Daryl Curran's A Moment in Photo History, which started in 1978. And selections from the sum total of about 700 photo-related events were recently displayed in LA. And to quote from the press release from that event, Curran was most active making this series during the 1980s, he recalls. But soon after, as photography was fully absorbed by the art market, and the argument for its importance no longer needed to be made, his activities slowed down. Quote, in a way, the artist observes, the very success and acceptance of photography doomed the project. In the meantime, I've so far neglected to mention something important that unfolded over those 20 years, 1980 to 1999, the digital revolution, which has changed just about everything about how images are captured and manipulated, disseminated, interpreted. Contemporaneous innovations in printing technologies allowed photographers to produce much larger prints that took over the wall space of paintings. We all know this story. When I got my first curatorial position in 2002, the only question anyone asked after any talk was, what about digital? That seems like a long time ago now. And actually does bring us to the 2000s and the 2010s. And I think we can all agree with the New York Times here in 2015 that the 70s are alive and well. In pop culture, we had, of course, the 8-season run of that 70s show, could not include it, and any number of films. And a lot of these focus on adolescence, not surprising given the fact that the writers and directors probably grew up then. And they freely mine the era's clothing and music from that greater distance. In addition to these stylistic hallmarks, there's an undercurrent, I think, of nostalgia for pre-cell phone, pre-internet communication, and a growing attention to the earlier era's sexual politics. And the fashion and photography connection was never more explicit than in this 2017 line by Ralph Simons, where I just would love to know what Robert Mapplethorpe would think about a shirt with his picture on it selling for, what is it, $1,700 or something? Maybe you can see it more clearly than I can. Susan Abeleys, a specialist at Bonhams, noted in 2015 that the 70s revival was good for business, especially in vintage sales and at auction. Quote, "The market is incredibly strong at the moment. There's always a 30 to 35-year gestation period. Right now we're seeing the tide turn. In general, the 70s was a time of experimentation. This open-minded approach brought new creativity, paving the way for today's contemporary art. That's why so much of it still feels modern," close quote. She was talking about jewelry, but the same can be said of photography. What was once a newcomer to the market, a curatorial department located in the basement, could now draw, and does draw, large audiences and high prices, as noted in the art press. Richard Prince's Untitled Cowboy, made in 1989 but reprising work he made in the late 70s, set a record for a contemporary photograph at $1.2 million in 2005. That seemed astronomical at the time. Fast forward to 2014, and a group of untitled film stills made by Cindy Sherman between 77 and 1980 realized 6.7 million. So it's a kind of exponential cycle. Museums can't necessarily compete in auctions at that level, but during the past 2 decades, we have been active in collecting photography from the 70s, whether purchasing from galleries and artists or benefiting from donations. As we all know in this audience, I think, important archives of 70s material have entered museum and library collections, although much planning and fundraising remains to be done to accommodate this generation of practitioners and fill out our history in our archives. To speak from my own recent experience at LACMA, one of our primary collecting areas is photography made in and about Southern California. So building on on the foundation established by Robert Sobiechek, during the past 10 years we've acquired several great works and collections from the 70s. Here's 2 examples here, Eileen Cowan and Michael Stone's work, and Daryl Curran and Barbara Caston, also in that category. Now, nearly all of these acquisitions have been made in consultation with the artists, so we've had the opportunity to ask questions about preservation and display, and these are particularly important issues when dealing with chromogenic prints, plastics, and various experimental materials. The reprinting or replacement of dye coupler prints from the 70s might even be called a new mode of acquisition. I have an example here from John Davola, but there's also a great one in this current exhibition with Joe Maloney's work. And this issue was discussed at last year's Symposium at SF MoMA, which its title kind of gives it away, Reprinting Color Photographs as a Preservation Strategy. And I know we have artists here who have worked in this area. John explained to me that the picture on the left is one of his own vintage prints that was kept in a freezer, kind of a best case scenario. And if you compare it to his current, a digital scan that shows the way that print, that image is intended to look, it's pretty shocking. The event at SF MoMA highlighted the role of artists as initiators and guides when reprinting is deemed necessary. It remains a case-by-case decision-making process for the most part, but one that really helps curators establish a solid understanding of these materials and set priorities, and one that we can share with visitors for their own education. It used to be when a museum goer would look at a wall label and ask, what does chromogenic print mean? I could say, oh, it's the same as a drugstore print, it's like what you get at the drugstore. Now, I think younger audiences are barely familiar with that scenario. And the current term we use, dye coupler print, probably means even less than C-print to them. I mean, we're at a point where chemical photography is now among the antique processes, or definitely going in that direction. As I'm sure this group knows, Polaroid went bankrupt in phases between 2001 and 2009, and of course, many films and papers have been discontinued. Meanwhile, Digital technologies, as I already mentioned, now readily available, have allowed photographers to mine their own archives to reprint, reinterpret, and extend their earlier work. And I wanted to touch back here on, I mentioned the Rephotographic project happening in the 1970s, and I think it's just amazing how Mark Klett and Byron Wolf have gone back and extended that project using the digital technologies at their disposal. So it's kind of an endlessly renewable resource, if you will. Yet another way in which 70s photography is visible to us in the 21st century is in the form of books. During the 70s, of course, pioneering titles were published by Aperture, which began producing books in 1965, by Lustrum, the imprint founded by Ralph Gibson in 1972, and others. And today, of course, we have Stidle, which started their photo list in 1996, the same year Radius was founded and Azrieli relocated to the US, and there are many more. We've seen photo books become highly collectible, as demonstrated in the Martin Parr and Jerry Badger compilations, which are probably on all of our shelves. Indeed, photo books constitute an area of stability in publishing, if you can say that, while much else has gone digital or is Amazon dominated. Leslie Martin of Aperture spoke in 2014 about photo books the way many commentators talked about photography 40 years earlier. Here's Leslie, quote, "The market is growing. It's one of those striated groups. There are fetishistic collectors who are willing to pay tens of thousands of dollars for older books. They may not be interested in newer books. It's like buying stocks. There are some people who want the blue chip, others want riskier investments. So they're buying 2 copies, one stays shrink-wrapped," close quotes. Just as artists may choose to reprint their photographs from the 70s, publishers have reissued books from that era. In 2017, Stidle came out with a reissue of Lustrum's Lines of My Hand, which we saw earlier, just a moment ago. Stidle also published Henry Wessel's 5 books, and in 2001, a new edition of Baltz's New Industrial Parks from 1974. Exhibitions, too, have been restaged. As you probably know, in 2009, the Center collaborated with the George Eastman Museum to reassemble and tour new topographics, the exhibition from 1975. And in the course of that project, I had the luxury and the pleasure of speaking with 8 of the 9 participating artists, and then the opportunity to see how powerfully the work resonated with younger artists. Mary Statzer and Cherry and Martin had a similarly strong impact with their reconsideration of photography into sculpture. And we should talk over cocktails about which shows should be revived next and restaged and re-examined. Photography is more available than some other media for such reassembly, since it often exists in multiples, and since so many of the artists make themselves available to supply not just their work, but also insights and perspectives. And I'd also like to mention in that context Jessica McDonald's volume on Nathan Lyons, and a number of kind of nearly coincident projects relating to color photography. All of these have added to the literature and drawn attention to rich primary sources, uncovered more ardent artists, and decentered the history beyond New York. And it's really been a privilege to be part of this generous and collaborative field. One last note on exhibitions. We are in a moment when 70s photography can be seen in many other kinds of group and solo shows, and I'm sorry I'm going to be a little LA-centric here, but that's my memory only goes that far. In 2012, the Getty Foundation sponsored a series of exhibitions under the Pacific Standard Time rubric, which many of you may have seen, and 70s photography appeared in several of them. And sorry, I didn't have room to cram in captions, but you can see Heineken and Berman at the Armory Center. Seismic Shift featured Louis Balt's Joe Deal in California landscape photography, curated by Colin Westerbeck. Under the Big Black Sun at MoCA included, among other photographic works, Ellen Brooks's Adolescence series, and at the lower right, site-specific at the USC Fisher Museum highlighted the LACPS and the politics of community. Pacific Standard Time LA, the next installment, expanded our sense of the period by featuring underrepresented groups and practices. For example, La Raza at the Autry Center brought to light the achievements of Chicano photojournalists during that period, and Radical Women at the Hammer revealed a trove of photo-based work. Many such histories remain to be explored, which leads me to hope that the 70s will be with us for a long time. George Blakely's palette of photographs was a commentary on the photo boom and the proliferation of photographs from the perspective of 1978. 33 years later, Eric Kessel's similar gesture requires an entire room to count for one day of image production. It can be fairly said that the photo boom never stopped, yet it is still relevant to examine the conditions that made it possible in the first place. The 70s were a time of national reckoning and economic recession in which artists stepped up to critique the status quo, assert civil rights, engage in environmental activism, offer new definitions of beauty and skill. In short, they changed the photographic medium. The creation of a market of MFA programs, museum departments were byproducts of the driving force of artists, and I really take inspiration from that. In conclusion, Stephen Shore's words here remind us to be aware of rewriting the past through the lens of nostalgia, whereas Norma Kamali's words remind us that it's okay to idealize creativity and to aspire to it. There's a scholar named Svetlana Boym whose writing is about nostalgia, and sorry, I was educated in the 90s, so I have to quote some theory, made a distinction between restorative and reflective nostalgia. Restorative nostalgia stresses nostros, that part of the word, home, and attempts a trans-historical reconstruction of the lost home. Reflective nostalgia thrives on algia, the longing itself, and delays that homecoming wistfully or ironically. So, close quote. Looking back at the 70s from our perspective in 2020, I think we can engage in both forms of nostalgia. We can appreciate the experimental ethos, the ambition, originality, and sense of community that animated the photography world during those years. That's the restorative effort. We can also, in a reflective effort, acknowledge the real struggles, inequities, and anxieties in that time and in our own. There are still many discoveries to be made. We have amazing resources like archives, oral histories, symposia like this one. I'm so excited to be in the audience for the rest of this weekend. I want to thank a few people for their helpful facilitation. I also want to thank Leslie Squires for all of her help over many years. And I want to thank all of you for your kind attention. Now, as Harold would say, onward. So I won't be taking questions from the podium. I don't want to slow us down. So I think we're going to have a seat and continue the conversation from the floor. And just if you can all help me remember and participate in, when we start having comments and questions from the audience, please wait for CCP staff to give you a microphone so that you can be captured in the recording of the event. And if you don't, I might shout at you to remind you. A lot of people out there, huh?
Wow. Looks like a light opening.
Yeah.
This is totally unreal.
Oh yeah, pull it.
Okay, this is, can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? Okay. This is totally unreal. There's no way anybody who was present at the opening of Light Gallery in 1971 could imagine this event. I'm so proud to be here. I wish Tennyson were here. He would have been amazed too. And I'm rendered speechless.
I guess we'll have to chime in then.
Well, I share Fern's view of it. It's quite amazing. It's a history that's really quite long overdue that has begun, and I just want to thank Britt for putting all of the 70s in the proper context. There's much more to do, of course, but I think you touched on the whole arc of the importance of the 70s, and in my view, there's hardly anything in the medium of what I now call the lens and screen arts still and moving that hasn't been touched upon in the 70s.
Yeah.
And I think Fern is the glue that connects all of us, actually. And to Tennyson and children of theirs. And it's really amazing to see so many faces and people here who we all have a long history and camaraderie, if you will, that's, you know, not lost on us, but lost on a newer generation that just couldn't happen. And I miss Harold, who's not here, but he will be here tomorrow. I had lunch with him. And certainly Victor Schrager should be here, and he's the other of the first three of us, and then there's a number after us. So thank you all for coming. I know there's a lot of questions to be asked.
We don't have to go through all of them. I mean,
I think
things
they're
are
good
gonna
questions.
things are gonna come up, of course, over the days. But I guess the first one that came to mind is how did you know that Light was onto something new?
When we opened. It was a long process to opening. Harold was very brave, moved to New York, looked for a space. That was an introduction to New York commercial real estate transactions, which was, I think, quite intimidating to him. He found the space. He assembled the coterie of artists, and Tennyson negotiated the lease with a very reluctant landlord who couldn't believe that photography could actually support himself, and he was pretty close to right. But the night we opened, the place was jammed. The landlord was there to check out things, and he was thrilled for us, I think, but also horrified that the fire department was going to arrive and kick everybody out of there because there were too many people for the allotted space.
So how had the word spread? Was it the network of friendships and
Yes, I
curiosity?
mean, at the beginning, a lot of people who showed up were not collectors because there weren't so many collectors. There were a lot of other artists showed up, a lot of students showed up, curators showed up, but collectors were few and far between. I mean, I think if you look through the invoice books, which are here, you'll see how slowly things got started.
And then, and from there, it was momentum, and people knew it was a scene they wanted to be a part of, and the openings looked like they were a lot of fun.
I wasn't at that first opening, but I knew about it.
Right, no, the first opening was amazing, and you know, when we opened, we had a show every month. Every fourth Friday night, there was an opening. Gradually, I don't know, sort of order emerged from the chaos, and we began to get reviews, and we started to sell, but slowly, and it took off from there.
Go ahead.
Well, you mentioned it briefly in your talk about something being in the basement. The truth is that photography itself was always in the basement of whatever institution embraced it, whether it was an art museum, whether it was a school, it was always in the basement. In the art department, it was either in the basement or in some other building that wasn't connected. And Light Gallery, in its first iteration on Madison Avenue and later on Fifth Avenue, certainly brought it out of the basement, as did MoMA and some other institutions. But suddenly, photography had a place where it was shown beautifully, respectfully, as an object of desire, if you will. And you know, it wasn't that there wasn't a community of cognoscenti and people who loved photography, and when finally it had the kind of place that Light was, there was Witkin, and there were other galleries, by the way, and there were other art galleries that showed photography peripherally. But then it had a place, a real place that stood up with any gallery in the world, actually, as a place. And I think that's important. The other one thing that I'd like to mention is that you didn't mention an important film, Blow Up,
68.
which turned on a whole generation of people wanting to be photographers, and schools, universities, and what have you suddenly started Photo 1 classes, and there were a couple of graduate programs around, but suddenly everybody wanted to take a photo course, and then you had to have a photo history course, and everybody wanted to take that. And so part of the audience, for sure, were all those young people who inevitably wanted to see what it was they were told about, who the masters were, and the history and so on. And there were, as Fern said, an awful lot of students, an awful lot of teachers, an awful lot of curators, and so on. I just want to tell one incident about that. When Light was at 724 Fifth Avenue, which was across the street from Tiffany's, which then was really kind of the center of the world, 57th and Fifth Avenue, if it isn't still. The elevator didn't work so well. It was kind of slow. I'm sorry, the elevator was pretty slow and didn't work so well. And I got on it with a prestigious owner of one of the galleries up above us, an art gallery, in quotes. And he said to me, "Charles, why do you allow all those students to come into Light Gallery? Don't you understand they hold up this elevator and they keep people from coming up who are serious people who want to buy?"
Well, I never heard that, or I would have gone out and punched whoever it was.
Yeah.
You know who it was. Anyway.
Well, it does seem like that generational mix was part of the energy.
Yes, our audience was always younger and hipper than any of the non-photography galleries we shared accommodations with. That's absolutely true.
So I'm sure there were networks of prior acquaintanceship that brought artists into the roster. Were you also getting portfolio submissions, kind of cold calls, all that kind of thing? How did that routine work?
Go ahead.
We got a lot of portfolio submissions, and in the end, Harold had to institute a program whereby you had to drop it off, leave it, let us look at it quietly. That meant Harold, actually, not anybody else, and then retrieve it a week later, because people thought it was going to be portfolio review on demand, which would have taken up all of the staff's time. I mean, there would have been no time to sell or to curate or to move exhibitions to other galleries. It would have been just portfolio review all the time.
And can you remember any discoveries that you were made that way?
No. But there certainly were, but I don't remember them.
Yeah.
You would have to ask Harold about that, and Victor and Charlie. But there was a constant stream of portfolios. Some of them were wonderful to see. Some of them were clearly student derivations of existing work.
Sure.
Mostly their teachers. But there was a lot of work, and there were a lot of people who were interested in being represented by a gallery, because that was new, really, to photography.
So you were really seeing such a range of what was being made at the time. And
Oh, I don't think there's any question. To Harold's credit, Victor's, and I think to mine and the others who followed, we tried as much as we could always to have some period of time to accept portfolios from the outside. And I think that kind of thing doesn't exist at all now, and certainly doesn't exist in the museums very much. And it made a difference, I think, to people who, at least it encouraged their aspirations. We did find some people, I won't go into the names, but there were indeed people who were found that way. And of course, we could follow them, come back a year from now, blah, 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 blah. So it was a very embracing thing, I think, for the community of photographic creative people.
Fern, did your background photo editing kind of carry over? Was it kind of a different, I mean, when it comes to installing, and,
No, first of all, I did not install, I didn't curate. I describe my early days at Light Gallery as depositing the occasional check when an invoice actually, when a print sold and an invoice actually got paid. I was
That
the
was a
bank
good
deposit
day,
person.
yeah.
That was a very good day. And I also used to describe my life as watching Tennyson's income as a sole practitioner lawyer, which was on one Schedule C and usually showed a profit. Come in, get deposited in his law practice account, and it would then move to our personal account, and then it would move rapidly to Light's account, which was a separate Schedule C, in order to pay the bills, because there were a lot of bills. I mean, we framed, we matted, we promoted, we took ads, we gave openings. We did a lot of work for our artists, and they were mostly very appreciative because this had not happened before.
Sure, and then they were getting reviews. The shows were reviewed, and that's a great resource now for us as historians of the period. What was your relationship with critics who wrote about the shows?
Well, we were very appreciative. It didn't happen a lot. I mean, I think our first review in the Times, as I remember it, I could be wrong, was Jean Thornton wrote a review that was headed, I think it was about our opening group show, which was headed, "Lights on, chin up." Because we actually had gotten the lights on and our chins were up and we were hopeful. I don't remember what he said about the artists in the show. I think it was our 7 original or 9 original artists. And I know that on the opening announcement, Emmett Gowan's name was misspelled, which I'm so ashamed of to this very day. But reviews came slowly, and reviews in monthly magazines came months after the shows were over, which is, they were not a selling tool immediately because it was a delayed reaction.
By the time I came to Light, which was 78, at the beginning of, Light was pretty well established, and there was a routine of also it was in a new spectacular place, of some critical review. Just 2 stories. One critic who worked for now defunct newspaper said to me, "If y'all don't give me an ad, I'll lose my job." So that was pretty weird. Hilton Kramer came to me at one point, and we had a discussion. I said, "Well, you got to do more criticism in the New York Times." And he said, "Well, who would you recommend?" And I recommended Andy Grunberg, who I think is here. And I think he was hired for to do a review very shortly thereafter, to Hilton Kramer's credit. But there was very little writing about photography, even by the time I came in, and then it sort of boomed right at the beginning of the 80s, both critical writing and reviews, if nothing else. So,
And did you work with various artists to install their shows? I mean, what was the routine there? A few all-nighters?
Oh yeah. Well, Larry, where's Larry Miller? And all of us, you know, we laid stuff out on the floor. Sometimes the artist would come in and say, "That's great," and well, let's move this, and then some other artists would come in and say, "This doesn't work. We can't stand this. Can't stand it." And you know, it was a big job, as Fern just said. You know, once a month you are repainting the whole gallery. You're putting it in beautiful frames. You're matting it, and I think the world didn't realize that to sell a $300 photograph, which was about the average price, more or less, a little more when they went up to $700, the overhead to do that is really quite the same as to sell a $10,000 painting. You know, you got to frame it, you got to mat it, you got to insure it, you got to deliver it, you got to do the invoicing, all of those things. You got to prepare the gallery, and that was, you know, really sort of the underlying problem of a photo gallery. You have to sell an awful lot of photographs to make up for that overhead.
Yeah, the other thing was that sometimes photographers were their own worst enemy because they never made an image they didn't love. So there would be arguments about, I mean, there were knockdown, drag-out battles about omitting things from shows because the photographers felt that they were the best curators of their own shows, and certainly Harold and Victor and Charlie did not agree. And that was difficult at times.
Yeah.
There were some artists who were very receptive to criticism and to winnowing, and there are others who really, really resented it.
And that was, and part of the kind of desired sort of appearance of the installations. It was a deliberate choice that it was kind of cleaner, more minimalist, and unlike, and now in the research here at CCP, you made the curators made the contrast between the Witkin Gallery, which was more maximalist and kind of a, you know, a domestic, kind of a more is more feeling, but the Light Gallery tended to be more.
Ours was more minimalist,
Yeah.
and we Lee Witkin had pictures in plastic containers in bins that you could leaf through. We did not have that. Ours were in flat files. You could look through them, but you had to, they were treated with a lot of respect. And also we didn't do floor to ceiling installations. We used the images as icons, and most of them in those early days were small anyway. So they were icons. They weren't giant wall pieces.
I put out a letter when I first came, maybe I don't know how far in, to a lot of the photographers. I said, might you consider limiting editions? Nobody agreed. No one, you know, we just wanted to discuss it, you know. Everybody was like, no, it's counter to the democracy of this of this process. And blah, blah. Of course, as you said earlier, they were very much limited because making more than 5 really good prints is pretty rare occasion, unless some edition was commissioned or something. But there were all kinds of fights like that. Well, you know, I don't want this picture here, and I want it over there, and you've taken it out, or you wrote a press release that I don't agree with, and so on and so forth. And on the other hand, there were photographers who were so delighted, and artists, we should call them, with the fact that they were being treated at this high level of professionalism in a really quite a glamorous space. I mean, when I came from Chicago and first saw it, I couldn't believe it, you know. It was like, you know, this is something very special. Photography had not been treated, at least in the commercial world, like that ever before, to my knowledge. You know, there were galleries, certainly.
Great. Well, I want to make sure we have some time to hear from our audience, too, before the reception starts. So, as I mentioned, please await a microphone, and we want to open up the conversation. Larry. What was the rent?
What was your
There's a
first
New
rent?
Yorker.
I think it was $1,500 a month.
I'll take it.
And that was a lot, because our first invoice was a Doug Prince box that was $150, and we had to give a 10% discount. And that, you know, that's what you were dealing with. There was a certain distortion between the income and the outgo.
Richard.
Did you may or mention this? Who were the first 7? I think you said 7 artists that you opened the gallery with.
Oh gosh, Harry Callahan, Aaron Siskind, Fred Sommer, Emmett
And
Cowan.
Ansel.
No, Ansel came much later. No, Kritesh came later too. Oh God, let's think. No, Siskin, Callahan, Gowan.
Crims?
Les Crims, Michael Bishop, Fred Sommer, that's 5. And I'm not coming up with the others. No, Arnold came later. Tom Barrow, of course. Is he here? Where is
Yeah, he is.
he? Right, Tom Barrow. B. Nettles, right. And I think that was it. I have it at home. What?
So, in the 70s, Tennyson was a lawyer. where did this come from to start a photo gallery? I mean, do you know where that came in his head, or how?
Well, when we got married, we started to collect graphics. And somehow Tennyson got the notion that collecting photography was going to be an idea. And he consulted various people about it. And the person who suggested Harold Jones was Sean Callahan, who was a deputy picture editor at Life. I had seen the work of Siskin and Callahan and other people at the Daily Telegraph, where I was working in London in 1969 because of Bill Jay. Bill Jay was my boss. He introduced me to a lot of things, a lot of photographers. But once Tennyson got this notion, and he talked to Sean Callahan, and it was Sean who mentioned Harold Jones and said, if you're going to do this, this is somebody you really need to talk to. And I know that Tennyson flew up to Rochester and interviewed Harold, and Harold said yes, and then rescinded the yes. And at that point, we were sort of dumbstruck. And then I think it's my recollection that Tennyson flew back up to Rochester, and eventually Harold said yes. And it was Harold who set the tone for the gallery. It was Harold who knew the artists. It was Harold who had the vision and brought it to reality, because Tennyson on his own could not have done that. It was Harold. It was Harold who had the relationships with the artists, definitely.
I don't think there's any question about that, but I think you're also, Tennyson had good instincts, and as did you, and you understood what good photography was. You might not have been able to pick out the specific younger people at the time, but one of the unique things about Light was that, and you could see that from that first list, was a mixture of some 20th century masters and some younger people who are now masters, and the vision to do the new, to see photography as something that new works that stretched the medium, that were pushing the boundaries of whatever the conventional world thought photography was about. And in a funny way, that worked to our disadvantage, because we were always trying to show something new or show something that didn't necessarily have an obvious market, which we could have done. And frankly, during my time, when some great vintage, well-known pictures came into the gallery, which then cost maybe $2,000, $3,000, we would turn them away and say, well, we're a gallery of contemporary photography. Right. And we should have bought them and stored them away, and now we would all be rich. But we didn't. We championed young and basically young and new photographers all the time.
In that group of the young and contemporary photographers, was there ever work that you said, oh, that's not photographic enough, or kind of in the way that we think of it?
Way we think of it now?
Then, yeah.
Yes and no. I proposed a show called Crossover, which was going to include a group of photographers, came out of the photo world. Let's say Tom Barrow was one of them, and Heineken and so on, and Jan Dibbets and Rauschenberg. And we were very hesitant about doing it. We had a whole list of people that would, artists using photographs and photographers making marks on things. And there wasn't a consensus in the gallery to do it, primarily because I still think we thought of ourselves as championing the medium of photography, and that we had to do that in order to get it out of the basement, so to speak. Yeah. And that if we did the other thing, we would be like other galleries. Mm-hmm. But it worked for us and against us.
Charlie, would you talk a little bit about the growth of the market? Because I think it was under your tenure that the invoice books went from being about this thick to being about this thick, and like multiple invoice books per year. And there was that instance with increasing Harry Callahan's prices
Yeah.
that generated a tremendous amount of printing for Harry and tremendous amount of sales. But Light was really kind of the vortex, because you guys were exclusively representing certain artists, and there was a growing network of galleries across the country and even in Europe that were showing and selling photography. Can you just talk a little bit about how that happened?
Well, I think you're really talking about 1979, 80 is when this big break occurs. Harry had had the big show at MoMA just, I think, 6 months, 7 months prior. And we raised the prices. We announced we were going to raise the price of Harry's work, I think from $400 to $750, but I'm not quite sure if that's right, but maybe it was more than that. Do you remember?
No, I don't.
Yeah, but anyway, it wasn't very much. And people flocked, it was at Christmas time, to buy Callahan's because he had just had a show at the Museum of Modern Art. And at the same time, all of the impetus of all those young people who had had photography in college and become amateur photographers or even serious photographers, they wanted to have a few pictures as they're collecting, in the same way that Fern talked about when she first got married to Dennison, of collecting graphics. Well, there were people who came in, they bought 10 pictures a year, the young people, at $300, and then
And paid off for them on a monthly basis.
right, and and
gave credit.
they were a big audience, and they've sparked it. Then it was pretty clear that I'll call the vintage early 20th century work was going up in price because it was getting written about, it was getting into the art history books. There were more critical writing going on. The auction houses were starting, and that was the beginning of the boom. It was suddenly, art was also becoming a commodity in the world of the well-to-do and so on and so forth. People wanted to collect contemporary works, and Light was naturally a place to go. That said, the overhead kept increasing to manage all of that. And then other galleries, even some in our building and some in New York, and the photographers came, well, so-and-so is opening in a gallery in LA. I need to have representation there. So we had to split part of the commission. And then, well, so-and-so is offering me this. And suddenly we were competing not only with the whole world, but with all kinds of galleries that were suddenly saying, we're going to be like gallery too.
Yeah.
So, but I think that's when it happened, about 80. Well, you were there, Rick, and you saw the books. But also the overhead went astronomically up. You remember there was inflation going on at that time, a big inflation. And that really, put a lot of pressure on. Our rent went up, everything went up.
And were buyers at that point from all over the country, all over the world? Was it
No.
New York centric?
What buyers?
Kind of a
There were mostly young people.
uh-huh.
There were, I would bet, 10 real collectors you could count on your hand, that you could count on who were going to be continual, but they were growing for sure.
Yes, and the other thing was that museums wanted to deal directly with the artists and not deal through a gallery. I mean, that
Right.
also,
That was
a problem.
and artists did it, sure.
Right.
Yeah, I remember one of the first auctions, we had an important piece in the auction that was, the photographer was collected by a major collector, and it didn't sell. And I remember coming back to the gallery, no sooner I got this angry phone call from the collector. Why didn't you bid it up? Why didn't you, make that picture sell? Don't you know you're hurting the whole market? And I being wet behind the ears, I had no idea that anybody did such a thing, But, so the pressure was on even at that time in terms of, let's make this market happen.
Yes, and the other thing that Light did was that we sent shows to museums. We handled all that for the artists. Now that did not make us a profit, and it tied up prints because there usually weren't that many prints. So all of a sudden our our commodity, if you will, was being shipped out to a non-profit institution. And eventually we got smarter and we told them they had to buy a certain number in order to have the show. And with other dealers, when we circulated shows, they also had to buy a minimum number. I think it was resented, but it was reality.
Yeah, that's certainly a
It's
standard
common practice,
practice.
I think, today.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it wasn't then.
No, there
Yeah.
were no standard practices when Light opened. We instituted the notion of standard practices, and it took us a long time to get to that place.
Sally.
First of all, I just want to thank you, Britt, for such a really impressive overview that sort of reminds all of us nostalgically in both the homeward way and also in the reflective way. So thank you, and thanks to the three of you for starting the discussion tonight. But the issue of portfolios suddenly reminded me, because I had forgotten about portfolios, and I worked at Light and remember people bringing boxes in. And I wanted to interject at this point a reminder to all of us that back then the standard was 8 by 10. And so people would bring a box or maybe 2 or max 3 boxes, 8 by 10 boxes in. And if the person was really working big, it would be 11 by 14.
Yes.
And it seems we need to remember this, the shift in scale, still through the 70s, with a few exceptions like Avedon, being really small. What Marvin tomorrow, I've always wondered about Marvin doing the real big picture, and it was this letting the monster out of the bag of monster sizes? But there really was a huge scale shift that made it possible for people to simply drop off a box of prints.
That's true.
And then later, the only thing one could imagine was doing a portfolio visit at an artist's studio, because the scale was out of the bag at that point.
Yes, but I don't think at Light that didn't happen because things were still small. And I have a personal theory that as people made more money and built bigger houses, art got bigger because the walls were bigger. I think there was a huge architectural cause and effect there. Photographs got bigger, paintings got huge, sculpture got larger, and there was a lot to do with square footage, cubic footage.
One of your questions, and it sort of relates to this, that market, I think, in the long term. Larry Miller came up with an idea that we should work with the American Institute of Interior Designers, and we did an important show, which was a little bit frowned upon by some of the people in the community, which 5 major interior designers designed spaces to put photographs in. But that opening was just jammed. I mean, you could not move with celebrities and all kinds of people there. And in retrospect, you now know that photographs and photographic collections are part of every interior photograph you see in any major interior magazine, whatever. And it did turn on, I think, the art buyers and so on and so forth in a new way, for that you could hang a photograph in your home, in your fancy home, even in your chintzy home, if you wanted, as a piece of art. And it was a remarkable show that I think its legacy is very important to the history of photography, actually. And created a market, a different kind of market.
Yeah. And also that there were art consultants. The whole notion of being an art consultant came into effect, and we had art consultants who were married to. We had one who was married to a rabbi, and she did a very good job of selling to her husband's parishioners. I was slow to recognize this effect, but Tennyson pointed it out quite clearly. So people had their own focused markets, if you will, And, you know, it worked to Light's advantage, but it was a whole new world out there, the world of art consultants, because they took very little risk, and they took a cut. That was new.
During Harold's tenure there, I understand he insisted on complete control over which artist he would show. Can you talk about why Ansel Adams wasn't shown during Harold's tenure?
Yes. What Light contracted to do was to represent new work by photographers. The first works that the first exhibition showed a sort of retrospectives, but from then on, the contract said that we would show photographers' work every 2 years, and it would be the work of the last 2 years. So that was the main reason for the absence of Ansel Adams in that show, because he was not making new work. He had done his work. Later on, when Ansel sold his limited editions, Tennyson decided that this was something that Light ought to participate in because there was money to be made, and that one of the points he made to a somewhat disappointed staff who felt that we were reneging on our promise to show new work was that we would, because we could sell the Ansel Adams for a profit, we could support a lot of artists who would not otherwise be profitable to Light. So there was that came into effect. But we were representing current work. And sometimes there was no current work to show. And sometimes the current work was not good enough to be shown. I mean, there were battles about that, I know, on a couple of occasions.
I had forgotten about that, about Ansel's, that very issue, because I was just assumed he was part of the first group. But going back to Rick's question, there's no question that when Ansel limited his editions, that really changed the photo market. That was big income for everybody who was involved in it. And people said, oh, the greatest photographer, or the best known photographer in the world, perhaps, you know, has done it. They were selling at remarkable prices, and they sold. And that was very important. So important that other photographers who thought they were just as important as Ansel, and probably were, said, I'm raising my prices. And that was the beginning of the price increases everywhere.
So at that stage, an artist would express an opinion about where the prices should go. It wasn't only, and was it at the beginning? It was
if Ansel's getting this, I should get this.
Yeah.
Right. And at the beginning, they were glad. I mean, Doug Prince was thrilled that we sold one of his boxes for $150. And Emmett Gowan was thrilled that we sold his prints for $150, $250. I mean, we're not talking huge amounts of money here. Even in those days, $150 was not a lot to pay for an image.
I'm interested in hearing some discussion about the place where all of the concerns of the market, which is, it feels like we focused a lot on that, intersects with the intellectual pursuit of photography, because I really feel like the people who Light represented, right, they start to indicate a shift, right? That a lot of these artists are considered, you know, sort of fundamental intellectual practitioners that sort of lead us into the space that Britt described in her keynote, where, you know, photography is commenting on popular culture, you know, media, reportage, right? And what kind of discussions were happening as you were thinking about your curatorial choices, as far as those sort of issues came to bear?
Well, I certainly was not privy to that. I mean, Harold arrived with a list, and I think the last person he signed up was Fred Sommer, because as I remember, Harold was afraid to call Fred, because Fred was such a purist, and he wasn't well known, but he was so highly regarded by people in the photography world. And I remember Harold being very happy when Fred said yes. And I think another shift occurred when Robert Heineken moved to our space at 1018 Madison Avenue. He had been with Lee Friedlander. His work was not what Lee's gallery was good at showing, and we could show Robert with a lot of respect, because we had a beautiful, even though it was small, it was a brownstone space, it was a beautiful, dignified space, and we could give his bigger pictures room to grow. That was a big step for us. Yes,
Yeah.
Lee Whitkin, yeah.
In my time, there was a lot of discussion about who and what and when we should show such and what kinds of shows we should do. We had a staff of very knowledgeable people who are all still, many of them are right here in the room now. And we were always concerned about, was this something that was pushing the medium, pushing our understanding of what the medium is about and how it moves forward, and yet representing those that had established that new vision of the new, we'll call it, and how many people can we represent? And obviously, as photography got more popular, there was, the need for other galleries to do things as well, that we couldn't do it, or we couldn't represent all the people that we might have even liked to have represented. And we reached out to Europe a bit, and we reached out quite a bit, thinking about, who's really doing something smart. And so we didn't have one kind of mantra or one kind of ideology about it. We had an ideology that was discussed intellectually, and we were knowledgeable people at that time. Remember, all of us came up through being photographers, being trained as artist photographers in institutions that were prized and that had real credentials, and we studied the medium. We didn't come from, somewhere else. We knew the medium quite well.
Very nice concluding summary, because it is now time for our reception. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.